Our story begins with the protagonist saying that she may have pitied her husband, but she could not love him. Then her husband's cane hit the ground hard, and step by step he began to approach the protagonist. Seeing his wife's frightened face, the guy asked her what is going on. He asks his wife if he really scares her even more when he is close to her. Right after that, he grabs the girl's hand, thus hurting her. Then, in aggressive form, he asks her if that is why she gave him horns. For those who don't understand, giving horns is cheating. After these words, he asks her if her baron is so good that she is even ready to cheat on her husband with him. He also asked his wife if the serpent had promised her that he would love her forever. Then the girl, with tears in her eyes, began to pull her hand out of his grip and said that he could think whatever he wanted. Then, her husband says that no matter what she does or how she tries to change it, she still has to be his wife, and he has to be her husband. At this point, the guy's eyes looked really furious and mad, while the girl looked at him as if she was scared. Hearing the words that they were still husband and wife, the girl tearfully asked her husband again, "Does he really think he has the right to call himself her husband?" As she said, he had never treated her the way a husband should treat a wife. Immediately after these words, she says that this marriage is over. Hearing these words, the man, whose face is full of all kinds of scars, freezes in surprise and just watches his wife. Immediately after that, still clutching her hand, he asks her if she really loves that baron, but the girl does not answer anything and just tells him to let her go. Not hearing the answer to his question, the guy got very angry and told her that she cannot escape from him. According to him, even in the other world she would not dare to leave, even if the cursed manor will fall on them. Hearing these words, the girl asks him why he does this to her. She snatches her hand out of his grip again and asks what she did to him. Leaving, the angry girl says she won't sit here anymore. She says she can't spend the rest of her life imprisoned as if she were a ghost. While the girl is trying to leave, she reaches the stairs. Then she tells her husband that he has no right to keep her here. But suddenly she steps badly on the stairs and starts falling down it. As she fell down the stairs, the girl thought about her life, as if talking to her husband. She recalls his question about whether she loved another man. The girl says that she could not afford it, because it was a luxury for her, because it was revenge, not love. According to her, it was revenge on the man who kept her locked up until she faded. Namely, it was revenge on Ian Nottingham. Just as the girl finished thinking about her life, she immediately crashed to death on the floor, at which point her blood splattered in different directions. At the same time, she is still conscious and realizes that in all likelihood, the end of everything will put it all her death. At this point, she even cried a little and thought about the fact that she lived in this hell for 6 years, and in the end will be nothing more than a disgraced, unfaithful wife. It also turned out that the last thing her eyes saw was her husband's desperate crying upstairs where the girl had stumbled, as if he was going mad from what he had seen. But the protagonist wondered if that was okay with her too. The girl said that if she could give him a single moment of despair, it was enough for her to be happy. And it also turned out that she believed that if she was destined for hell, alive or dead, she was ready to come to Hades, because at least in his domain she was free from her husband. However, when she opened her eyes, she found herself not in hell or heaven. She woke up 17 years old herself in the Roanfield estate. Then the girl was reading a newspaper about a maid preparing her hair. At this point, she looked a little glum. Then the maid asked the girl if she has become better. Hearing this question, the girl was clearly surprised, but then noticed it. The maid asks her mistress not to pretend, because in recent days, she has been terribly unwell. According to the maid, they are all frightened, as if she did not have any serious disease. Hearing this, the girl thinks about the fact that according to her assumptions for these 3 days, she has been acting like a madwoman, crying and laughing and so on and so forth. But she dismisses these thoughts and tells her maid that she has come to her senses and that she is all right. But the maid decided to ask her mistress if she was worried about something, because she had never read a newspaper before, but now she reads it with interest. But the girl says that she is fine. And we can notice that on the newspaper, it says that it is April 1914. It turns out that 1914 was a critical year in the life of the protagonist. It was in this year that her life completely went down the drain. After the death of her mother, she and her father led a relatively happy life. Her father loved to bathe in luxury and live on a wide, aristocratic leg, and she at this time did not care about anything but beautiful dresses. What to say about the events that were happening in the world, which obviously also did not affect the girl. Because of all this, it's pretty clear that none of them kept up with the times. And on the night that a risky investment caused them to lose their entire fortune, something happened that the girl couldn't have expected, and that scarred her for life. All because the girl entered her father's office and saw her father hanging. It turned out that that night her father hanged himself in his office, in his will, which he put after himself. There was not a single word of sympathy addressed to his daughter. It was because of this that her life went down the drain. For what could a young girl do without a dowry? She married the Earl of Nottingham, whom she had never met before in her life. Well, then the protagonist realized that even this was for a girl like her a gift from above. But she is well aware that it would be so if this count would not have returned from the war terribly maimed. However, that's exactly what happened, and they dragged each other into the abyss of despair. And their marriage ended in tragedy, in the fact that they hated each other, and in the fact that the protagonist eventually tripped and crashed, falling down the stairs. Already walking on the street with an umbrella in her hands, the protagonist realizes that since she is 17 again, they will soon be left at a broken trough. But she is well aware that if she can convince her father not to invest in the company, then maybe their future will change. But her short-tempered father went on a grand tour, at a time when they should be counting every penny, for those who do not know the grand tour. This is a trip to Europe which was popular with the English gentry from the 17th to the 19th century. Her father went to Rome to see the art of the Renaissance. It turns out that the fact that he did not even mention her in the will, at that time incredibly knocked the girl out of her rut. Suddenly someone calls Madeline. So yes, the girl noticed that this person is her father. At this time, the happy father asked his daughter if she came to meet him. The father also says that it is very nice of her. After these words, he calls his daughter to him and tells her to get into the crew. And the girl says that she would be lying if she said that she never resented her father for leaving her like that. And still, some part of her missed him very much. After all, she grew up without needing anything, and must be grateful to him for that. Getting into the carriage, the girl realizes that she has no right to miss the second chance given to her. The girl decides that she must find a way to get them through these difficult times. But she also realizes that the most important thing is that she must avoid meeting the count to whom she was married at all costs. But as soon as she got into the carriage to her father, he told her that he had invited a special guest. Immediately after that, the father asked his daughter's permission to introduce this man to her. Then on the girl's face froze surprise, because her father introduced her to Mr. Nottingham, the same earl to whom she was married. Only now this guy looked not at all maimed and quite an attractive young man. Dear friends, and if you want me to make for you the second part of this story, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and do not forget to click on the bell. When under this video will accumulate 40,000 views or 5,000 likes, I will start working on the second part for you. Then, in the carriage, the girl's father asked the count if he had finished all his business for which he had come to town. He also said that he hoped that by his invitation he had not taken the count out of his busy schedule. Then the count said that it was not so at all. After the earl's words, the girl's father said that he was very pleased to hear such words from him. At this moment, the earl just looked out the window and did not show any emotions, while the girl thinks that in her past life at this time he was in London, so she never saw him before the wedding. Also, the girl's father praises the guy because according to him, he heard that another of his investments has succeeded. Also, the girl's father starts praising the guy, saying that his business acumen is incredible. At this point, the protagonist looked very disappointed. She wondered if this man was really the count she had married. From the look in her eyes, you could tell that she was pretty disappointed, but it was because she couldn't believe it. At this point, the protagonist thinks that this simply cannot be because in her past life, Count was a completely different person, even more of a monster than a man. In her past life, Count constantly yelled at her without reason. He told her not to even dare to touch him, and he was so angry about it that even broke the dishes. Of course, then the girl tried to explain herself somehow, and a little to cool the ardor of the Count. But she did not succeed, because the Count just fell from his nerves. Then his servants always gathered around him and called him a doctor. The girl looks right at her past husband and wonders if that's exactly what kind of monster he was, but now the guy looks completely different and seems like a completely different person. After these thoughts, their gazes touched. The incredibly handsome Count could not even take his gaze away from the girl, but already she lowered her gaze a little and even a little saddened from all the memories she had. She realizes that she is sitting opposite the Earl of Nottingham, but this is not the man she knows. Then her father intervenes in their glance and tells the Earl that he has heard that he loves riding. The Earl replies that this is exactly the case, but at the same time he makes a small clarification and says that he especially loves horse racing. The girl's father, hearing this, is very happy and says that this is a very refined nature with refined tastes. Hearing this, the girl blushed a little and became even sadder. She went into her own thoughts and thought that she could not understand how this man could like horse racing. After all, this man is not suffering from a limp or raising his voice at her and cannot be the same man from her memories. At that moment, some memories from Madeline's past life come to mind. At that moment, she was 22 years old, and the girl in a bride's dress with a bouquet in her hands was waiting for the marriage ceremony to begin. At that moment, one of the servants of the house passed by her and asked her mistress if she was worried. Then the girl said that she probably was. Seeing the worries of this girl, butler said that his lordship is a very good man, and therefore the girl should not be afraid to marry him. Then Madeline said that she is not afraid of him, but only worried whether she can become a good spouse. At this point, the girl even blushed a little blush. It turns out, Madeline didn't hate Ian from day one, even though they didn't love each other. She still wanted them to have a good marriage. She even made a vow to be a beacon for a man so scarred, and to be faithful to him, and to help in his recovery. Also, at that moment, she vowed to become a wise and worthy wife, but on their first wedding night, her humble dreams went to waste. Then she waited for him all night, but the Count never opened the door to their bedroom. It did not happen the next day, or even a day later. Obviously, the girl's dreams were broken, but after a while, she still saw her spouse in the hallway. Only she tried to say something to him, as the guy passed by her without even paying attention to her. It surprised her very much at that moment. It turns out the protagonist even always ate alone, because her husband did not want to spend a single minute of his life with her, the girl in that estate surrounded only by servants. But notwithstanding such a difficult life, the girl decided to go to her husband's office. She told him that it seemed to her that he had forgotten about her existence. Then she looked very upset, but the mutilated guy said that this was not true at all. Madeline looked at her husband in disbelief and decided to tell him that she was rather bored. Her husband looked surprised, but he still didn't put his papers aside and decided to spend at least some time with her. The next day, the main character was visited by the same servant who talked to her on the day of the wedding and said that his master sent his wife a gift. This gift was a small and very cute dog, which all trembled. Seeing this, the protagonist closed the book she was reading and looked at the cute dog and wondered if her husband was really giving her a puppy so she wouldn't get bored. At this point, the girl didn't seem at all enthusiastic about the gift, but she still dared to touch the nose of the puppy. At this time, the puppy was still trembling, but suddenly he licked the finger of the protagonist, thus showing her his love. Seeing this, the protagonist let out a tear and took the puppy in her arms to hug it, at which point she realized that this puppy was just as scared as she was. Suddenly, the protagonist is brought back from her memories because the coachman reported that their carriage had arrived at their destination. After they got out of the carriage, the protagonist's father told the Earl that this was their home, Roanfield Manor. According to him, it was built in the Renaissance style. According to him, in their part of the country, few people build such buildings. At that time, one of the butlers came out to greet the hosts. He congratulated them on their return and asked his master if the trip had gone well. Then Madeline's father said it had been fine and emphasized that they had a special guest. So he asked his butler to prepare the best tea and cookies. The father's desire to bring Madeline and the Earl together is also evident, And he shows this by asking his daughter if she would like to show Mr. Nottingham around the estate until the servants set the table, naturally remembering her past life. The girl tries to refuse somehow and says that she is not feeling well. The father asks her if she can play something on the piano while he and the Earl are having tea, but the girl refuses the request, arguing that she would like to lie down while looking directly at the Earl of Nottingham. Then the father tried to say something to his daughter to persuade her, but the Count immediately took the girl's side and said that he did not mind if she left them. At the same time, he bowed a little to the girl and said that he was very glad to meet her. The girl in turn apologizes to the Earl for not being able to attend the tea party, but she thinks that her ex-husband Ian Nottingham is in her house right in front of her, but now he is not yet broken by misfortune. The moment this thought flashed through her mind, the girl thought about whether she should intervene in his life and make sure nothing happens. At this point, she really looks like she would have thought about his life. At the same time, immediately afterwards, the girl asks herself, did she not have enough patience with him and thought that their way together had no future, so in her opinion, they had better never get close again. At which point, looking at the Count, the girl decides to leave, all because she thinks that if she does so, they will both be better. At this moment, the Count looks quite sad, but the girl realizes that if this short meeting will be the last, everything will probably be much better. She thought that this way she could escape her past life, and then she wouldn't have to cross paths with him ever again. The actions are moved forward sometime. Then the girl reads a list of actions that will happen in future years. At this time, the girl reading it thinks that before the war starts, they need to sell the estate with the land. She realizes that if they keep track of the expenses and move to the village, they will be able to hold out. But at the same time, she also realizes that if she does not make her father stop gambling and throwing money around, they will definitely end up on the street. At this point, the girl thinks about what she should do in this case. As suddenly she hears a knock on her door. Madeline's father knocked on her door. The man asked his daughter if he could come in, and then the joyful girl said that of course she did. She wanted to visit him herself, according to her own words. After Madeline's father came into her room, he put a letter on her table. Then the man told her that it was an invitation from London for her. He said it was the right time for her to make her debut in high society. At this moment, the man looked really happy, while the girl couldn't take her eyes off the letter. But the protagonist realized what awaits their family in the future, and thought that now is not the time for balls and social gatherings. She still decided to ask her father if she is obliged to debut in high society. Hearing this question, her father was quite surprised, and then he dared to ask his daughter if she was unhappy. Of course, the girl was very much surprised by this question and interrogated what her father meant. Then the man said that he had noticed that she had been reading books and lecturing him all day about spending less money, and now she refused to get married at all. But sweetly sipping tea, the girl said she had said no such thing. Then the confused father informs his daughter that refusing to make her debut in high society is like refusing to get married. According to him, he even bought them a townhouse in London so they could stay there. But the girl at that moment put the tea on the table, and as if she was going to say something, suddenly she told her father that they should sell the house. Of course, her father is very angry about it because he is trying very hard for his daughter and her future. He asks his daughter not to talk nonsense. Also, Madeline says that her father should forget about the investment in the wine business. Naturally, the man was very much surprised at this financial advice from his daughter and asked her how she knew about the investment. But immediately the man's face changed. He asked his daughter, did she really read his private letters? According to him, this is very mean and low on her part. Because of this, the father became very angry. The man also tells his daughter to stay away from his business, for such things are not in the mind of a young lady. And hearing this, the girl is very much upset, and after taking the letter in her hands, said that if her father put a penny more of the guilt of the business, she would not even look in the direction of society. At the same time, she also said that if he did that, she would certainly not get married. These words sounded like an ultimatum to her father, which naturally made him very angry. But the girl went on talking and smiling, said that she was giving some information to her father, and that if he persisted, she would be a nun without remorse. Naturally, her father got even more angry because of these words. And because of this, he had a tremor. He told his daughter that he had had enough, and also told her that she was not allowed to leave the room until she apologized to him for these words. Unexpectedly, after this conversation, the action moves to London. There is some ball, but he is not interested in the girl, and she communicates at this time with her father about his investment in the wine business. She asks the man if he is sure that he put the contracts on fire. Of course, her father says that it is exactly like that, but I specify that he could not do otherwise, because the girl was with him all the time. But very clever protagonists ask if the father had copies. Then the man says that everything. Of course. So, because he has no reason to lie to her, well, you can see how the father is very worried to say it. Immediately afterwards, the father asked his daughter to allow at least someone to ask her to dance, because according to him, she has already refused 6 invitations. The man asks his daughter what came over her, because she scared away all the young people. Then, the slightly saddened girl says that she is just not sure yet. Hearing this, her father started to get a little annoyed. Then he sadly said that she, as the daughter of his family, has a duty to marry well and support their family. At the same time, the man stepped aside a little and angrily said that he honestly does not quite understand her, while the girl obviously understands that this season of social gatherings will still come to war, which will soon begin. And she also thinks about her role. It turns out that the girl does not want to continue to play the role of a beautiful doll, because this time she wants to choose her own fate and control her life, so that everything does not work out the same way as it was in the past life. She thinks that if she can keep her family from collapsing, she can probably find the right way to live her life. While holding a fan in her hand, she also realizes that maybe she will continue to learn to play the piano, because she heard that after the war, women could work too. Thinking about the way she plays the piano, it's as if the girl's soul starts to rejoice, and the girl herself also shows signs of joy. She thinks that in such a case, she might one day find a job that will be to her liking too. Suddenly, some young guy starts approaching the protagonist. After he approaches, we find out that this guy is the Earl of Nottingham. A smiling guy with a glass of wine in his hands tells the protagonist that apparently the holidays do not attract her at all. At this time, the girl is as if a little startled to see her ex-husband. Here, she tells him that it is not at all. And then afterward she asks if the Count doesn't think all this is strange. But the guy immediately changed his face. He asked the girl how it can seem strange, because he only sees that people are having fun from the heart. Then Madeline said that it pisses her off to watch people having fun without any idea what awaits them in the near future. Then the Count laughs a little and says that there is some truth in the words of the main character. At that moment, the waiter came up to them, and then the Count put his glass of wine on the tray and said that nobody knows what the future holds for them, and they dare not even guess about it. Right after that, the guy asked, so why don't they enjoy the present moment while they have the opportunity? He tells the girl that she should relax a little, because refusing to enjoy the present moment won't keep tomorrow from coming. Hearing these words, Madeline seemed to think about them, but she still remembered some moments from her past when she was completely miserable. Turning her head away from the Count, she tells him that she is already quite relaxed. Naturally, the guy is a little surprised by this behavior, but then the girl said that she was just thinking that such meaningless festivities are just a waste of time. The guy smiled a little at her thoughts, but the girl decided to explain to him what she meant. She said she thought there was no value in it all, but she didn't do anything about it because she didn't want to ruin people's holiday. She just didn't want to do it herself. Then the boy once more grinned and asked if the girl would like to dance with him. Of course, Madeline was very much surprised when she heard this question, and apologizing to the Count, asked what he had said as if she had heard nothing. Then the Count, bowing a little to the girl, calls her darling and asks if she will give him this dance. At this moment, the girl's face changed, as if she was afraid for her future. She reflected on the fact that she didn't have to save anyone, and yet she didn't have to save her ex-husband Ian. She had always been adamant that she should use her second chance at life to get as far away from him as possible. However, she is well aware that if nothing changes, the Count will go to war, and there with him will happen the most terrible things. The girl realizes that the war will treat not only his body, but also his soul. So in her opinion, a little nudge in the right direction for the guy will not hurt him in any way. And even on the contrary, will benefit. The girl decides to do it if it will change his life a little bit for the better. She thinks that maybe she can afford to give this guy a little advice. Suddenly, the action of the story is transferred to some time ago. Then 3 young men were chatting among themselves. One of them, with a cigar in his hand, tells his friends to look at the main character. But the other replies that there are too many women here for him to know which one his friend is talking about. And then the guy says he's been counting all night how many men this lady has already blown off. According to him, she's already turned down 6 young men while they've been sitting here. According to him, she refused to dance with 6 men who approached her. Also, according to the young man, this girl has just made her debut in high society, so apparently she's not too desperate yet. Although, in his opinion, she doesn't look that straightforwardly old, at this time the Earl of Nottingham walks through the hall with a cup of tea in hand. At that moment, he sees Madeline and remembers that she is the same girl he met at her father's estate. He remembers that she refused to spend time with them and said she wasn't feeling well. He realizes that she is the Baron's daughter. The Count thinks it's pretty funny, at which point one of his friends asks if he should approach this girl. But the other one replies a bit emphatically and says he doesn't even know her, and it's rude to approach strangers. In his opinion, for they were no longer of the Victorian age, in his opinion it was rude to make conversation with a lady in their day, at which time the Earl placed his mug on the table. Then one of his friends says that he will go up to her and then they will all see what happens. But suddenly, the Earl of Nottingham puts his hand on his friend's shoulder as if to stop him. Immediately after that, the Earl stands up and walks towards the girl while his friend freaks out about it. Then the second young man, who is a more aristocratic person, said that he did not think he would live to see the day when the Earl of Nottingham himself would approach a lady and dare to make conversation with her. Now, the action of the story is carried forward for some time. Some girls are talking among themselves about a nice couple, for they notice that these 2 are dancing the 4th dance. Another girl asks who is the lady, for she dances with Mr. Nottingham himself. Then, the second girl answers her friend's question and says that as far as she knows, this girl is some noblewoman who came to London from the provinces. At this time, the Earl is dancing with Madeline, and they do not take their eyes off each other. Then, suddenly, the Count turned to his passport. He asked the protagonist, "All is well with her?" Of course, the girl is a little surprised by such a question, but the Count then drew the girl's attention to her hands that are very much trembling. Then the girl looked at the Count with a very strange look, and Ian noticed it too, and said that on top of everything else, the girl was looking at him as if she was sorry for something. Then, after those words, their gazes crossed. The girl wondered if there was any point in telling him everything. At this point, they were still holding hands and her hand was shaking very badly. But she had a second option, which was to just let go of his hand and never regret it. Suddenly, the girl stumbled a little and began to fall. Then the Count grabbed her and was able to hold the girl. At this point, she was well aware that if somehow their fates intertwined again, she could again go through years of loneliness and despair. Because of all this, she is likely to live an unhappy life again. At this point, she wonders what will happen next. At this point, she remembers a moment from her past life. This flash of memory was triggered by a petal falling from the head of a girl who was next to them. It turns out that at the moment she remembered the girl was 26 years old. Then she came to the garden and saw that there was a huge number of roses torn off. Of course, slowly very upset about what she saw, and wondered who could have done it because every person on the estate knows how much she cares about the garden. At that moment, right behind her back ran the same dog that had already grown up. Then, looking at her doggy, whose name is Corey, she asked him if this mess is his paw's business. At that moment, the doggy just turned around and barked sweetly. Then the girl looked at her doggy with emotion. Then Corey ran right up to his mistress and barked again, wagging his tail, which made the girl think that maybe it wasn't him, because maybe her dog couldn't have eaten the rose, but it was unlikely that he would be able to bite it off so evenly. At the same time, the girl said that whoever it was, she only hoped that the thwarted rose had brought him some joy, at which point she was communicating with her dog and he seemed to be responding to her. Right after that, the action of the story is moved forward for some time. There was a very heavy downpour outside, but the main character went outside to look for her dog. At this time, one of the maids and the butler ran out after her. The maid tried to convince her mistress that the rain was too heavy and she might catch a serious illness. But the girl did not care at all and continued to look for her dog. The butler also says that he will look for the dog as soon as the rain passes, and he asks the lady to go back to the house. But the angry protagonist with tears in her eyes turns to the butler and tells him to go back, because she is not going to do it. The girl says that she will find the quarry herself. Then the butler Sebastian says that he can't leave the lady, but the girl asks him not to pretend to care for her, and then she asks him if he is afraid that the Count will get angry. Then Sebastian says that he is not and that it is about something else. Suddenly, some man dressed in elegant shoes makes a couple of steps on the ground. He calls the protagonist, and then all the people who were on the street with surprise looked at who called the mistress. This man turned out to be the Count himself, who ordered his wife to return to the manor. Of course, the girl who cries and suffers a lot because of the loss of her friend refuses to do it, referring to the fact that she has not found her dog. But the cold-blooded Earl of Nottingham looks straight at his wife and asks her to forget about this dog. He says it's just an animal, and he can't let a man fall ill because of some dog. At this point, the protagonist began to choke on her tears, looking directly at her husband. She asks him, how can he do this to her? Because he gave her this dog. According to her, this dog was the only one in the estate who cared about her. Then, after these words, the Earl of Nottingham touched Madeline's shoulder, and it seemed as if his heart had softened a little, but he still did not change his mind and ordered his wife to go into the house. At this moment, the girl who was all weepy was still shocked at the callousness of her husband. At this moment, they were both in the pouring rain, at the archway that led into the park at the Count's estate, not looking into each other's eyes as if there were some understatement between them. The girl came back from her memories when the Count called her back in the present time. He put his hand on her shoulder in the same way and asked her if she was all right. It was obvious that these memories were affecting her a lot. Immediately after that, the girl removed her ex-husband's hand from her shoulder, and she also lowered her gaze as if she didn't want to look at him. She also decided to answer the guy's question about her well-being and said that she was fine. After that, the suddenly sad girl bows to the Count and says that it was a pleasure to spend time with him. At this point, she looks very sad, which is obviously related to her memories. Also, the girl says goodnight to the Count. Immediately after that, having lowered her head down and being still sad, the girl as if she was going to leave the ball, the Count himself at this time looks at her back and tried to understand what is going on. The Earl began to wonder about the girl's cold behavior with him. He realized that she did not warm up even after 4 dances. Because of all this, Ian Nottingham remains somewhat disappointed. After some time, a whole bravado of waiters set the food on the table for the aristocracy. At this moment, the girl is also at the table, and thinks about the fact that she certainly did not expect that all her life will avoid the Count, especially in such a narrow aristocratic circle. But in her opinion, that still didn't mean she expected to be sitting right across from him at this ball, and she especially didn't want to be a part of a high-pitched conversation. At the same time, the girl realizes that no matter what her expectations are once again not justified, at this time, she watches some aristocratic person screams loudly at the Count and asks, how dare he say such a thing? At this point, Ian is being extremely restrained and calm, telling the woman not to get emotional and to lower his voice, and we learn that her name is Isabel. The Count continues to talk and tells the girl that this is why she is being manipulated by that lowlife. Because of these words, Isabel is even more angry and once again asked how she cannot indulge in emotions. Sitting at the table at this moment, Madeline finally realized what the girl she had heard a lot about was. It turns out this girl's name is Isabel Nottingham. Turns out, when she married the Earl in a previous life, he had no living relatives. His younger brother Eric volunteered for the front lines and died in battle. And his sister Isabel, who is now at the table with them, died in an accident before the start of hostilities. There were rumors that the accident was not even an accident, but a set-up accident. Apparently, his sister was with a man who was from a much less noble family than she was. And then because they couldn't overcome the prejudice of society, they decided to end their lives together. The girl also thinks about the fact that in her past life there were times when she thought that Ian would not be so broken if he had living relatives, and during the girl's thoughts, some guy who was standing next to her told her something, but she did not even pay attention to it. It also turns out that after Isabel's death, Ian never touched her things and kept them in their places, as if he wanted to have an eternal reminder of her bitter regret and longing. The story moves back to Madeline's past life, when she was 22 years old, when she came across a piano played by Lady Isabel, and when she looked around, she noticed that there was not a speck of dust in that room, and then she realized that this room was very well taken care of. She noticed that both the piano and the whole room is cleaned to a shine. She thinks that probably the Count loved his sister very much. During her thoughts, the girl notices that the wind blew away some photo, paying attention to it. The girl began to wonder, what is this photo? Because of her curiosity, she decided to pick up a picture from the floor and see who was in it. It turns out she saw Lady Isabel and some guy with her that she didn't know, but the girl noticed that there was a signature on the photo. It turns out that this photo was signed by Isabel for her favorite man, whose name was Zachary Myloff. She looked towards the piano. She noticed that behind the sheet of sheet music there were several photos visible. Then Madeline thought that this photo must have fallen out of there too. Right after that, she put the photo back down. After the girl put the photo back, she noticed the music notation. The girl noticed that it was handwritten, and then Madeline wondered if Isabel had really composed these pieces herself. Then Madeline realized that Isabel had written this song for her lover. It turns out that the protagonist had heard that the guy was a socialist, but even though she doesn't know much about politics, the girl understood the meaning and position of the guy. Then, touching the piano, Madeline wondered what her husband's sister was like. She wondered if Lizabelle was a sophisticated lady who loved to play the piano, or was with a woman in whom life and passions were so strong that she was ready to die for the sake of her love. At the same time, during these thoughts, the girl sat down at the piano and thought that no matter how it was, it would not change anything. But then she suddenly came to the thought that whatever Isabel was, the sound of her piano as she walked the earth must have enveloped even this gloomy estate in a sunny and pleasant embrace. Then, looking at the sunny windows, the girl thought that if Lady Isabel were alive, maybe the Count would be a different person, not so cruel and heartless. But suddenly the Count himself burst into the room. Naturally, the protagonist was very surprised to see her husband here. But then the trembling and angry Earl of Nottingham immediately ordered his wife out of the room. Naturally, the girl was a little frightened and surprised at this behavior of her husband, and holding her hand on the piano which belonged to the Count's sister, she said that she was his wife, and therefore should not be spoken to in this way. According to her, if the Count had any respect for her, then let him be pleased to explain to her why she should leave this room. But the still shaking Count did not appreciate the girl's boldness and became even more furious. Ian, in a fit of anger, ordered his wife not to dare to enter this room again. Naturally, because of such an aggressive reaction to her entering the room, the girl then almost cried. Immediately afterward, the action shifts back to the banquet, with the girl reflecting on the fact that at that point in time in her past life, based on his reaction, she assumed he was strongly attached to his family. But now she sees them literally ready to at each other's throats. Suddenly all the thoughts of the main character is cut off by Isabel herself, who stood up from her seat, loudly began to yell at the Count and said that he is nothing. Immediately after these words, she took her hat. When her brother saw that, he ordered his sister to sit back down and asked her where she was going. But then the angry Isabel said that she had had enough, because his company was making her very stuffy. The girl also said that she no longer wants to live like this. Hearing these words, the face of the protagonist immediately changed. In her head came up some memories that can very much affect the course of her life. After thinking for a minute and remembering a bunch of newspaper articles, the girl remembered that today was the day the Count's sister died in that very accident, at which time Isabel was just leaving the event in a hurry. Seeing the reaction of the protagonist, the guy who has been trying to talk to her all this time tells her that lately Graf has been fighting with his sister a lot. But the protagonist is not interested in communicating with him as if before. She just gets up from her seat and tells this guy that she will be back soon, and the girl hurriedly leaves the ball just like Isabel. Naturally, the young man tries to somehow bring the girl back, but he does not succeed, and the Count just stares at her back. While the rest of the people remain at table, Madeline runs up the stairs after Lady Isabel and calls out to her to warn her against tragedy. Then Madeline catches up with Isabel and seizes her by the arm, while Isabel is drowning in her tears. But Isabel doesn't seem to react to the girl, and apologizing tells her that she has to go. Madeline at this time does not give up hope of convincing Isabel to stay. Then Madeline decided to strike a decisive blow and used the knowledge from her past life. She asked Isabel if she was going to see her young man now. These words very much angered the Countess. Turning around, she asked in raised tones if she slowly realized that all this time the girl was eavesdropping on their conversation. But Madeline says that it is not so. Isabel naturally doesn't believe Madeline's words and says she still thinks the main character was eavesdropping. But she notes that the people who say that her brother is surrounded by all sorts of sassy women were right. Then an angry Isabel leaves and asks Madeline, does she really think she can get the Earl's attention with this obscene behavior? Then suddenly Madeline pulls Trump out of her sleeve and asks if Isabel is headed for Mr. Myloff. Naturally, these words catch Isabel's attention, and she softens up a bit. Then Isabel turns around and asks Madeline how she knows about him. But then Madeline says Isabel doesn't have to worry about it because she won't tell anyone. She says she doesn't know about socialism or whatever it's called. But Isabel is still worried that the girl knows so much about her personal life, and because of these worries, she asks Madeline if she is not her brother's informant. Then the girl says that it is certainly not true. She said the Earl of Nottingham was a gentleman, but not without a flaw of stubbornness. Isabel was a little angry and said that she would not call her brother a gentleman at all. But Madeline noticed that her brother was also a bridge in bringing people under himself. Isabel blushed a little when she heard these words. And thinking over the girl's words, she said that as far as she could see, it seemed to her that Madeline knew her brother very well. Then Madeline took Isabel's hand and asked her not to give in to his stubbornness and desire for control, for she had once broken her pride for a man and ruined her life by it. According to her, she even took the road without return just to vent her anger. It turns out at that moment, when she squeezed Isabel's hand, she wasn't worried about getting in touch with her brother. At that time, Madeline just wanted to save the woman in front of her. It's because Madeline knew that the woman Fury had blinded would meet a sad fate. By that woman she meant Isabel, and she noticed that Isabel looked a lot like her. Then, holding Isabel's hand, Madeline says it may seem like there's no other way out, but it's not true. She says there are many roads in the world that Isabel hasn't tried to get off of yet. These words made Isabel think for a moment. Not thinking long, Isabel decided to boldly ask Madeline to let go of her hand. At that moment, some male figure approached them from behind. It could be seen by the shadow that fell on the stairs. It turned out that the one who approached them from behind was the Earl of Nottingham himself. Naturally, both girls were a little surprised at this, but the Earl threw his gaze on the girls' hands that were intertwined. Naturally, Ian was puzzled because he didn't quite understand what was going on. So he decided to go down to the girls and told Madeline that it was a matter strictly between him and his sister. He asked Madeline to leave them alone, but Isabel herself clutched Madeline's arm and said she didn't want that, and she asked what the main character's name was. Then the protagonist told Isabel that her name was Madeline Rowanfield. Upon hearing the name of her protector, Isabel started yelling at her brother again and told him that she would stay with Rowanfield. Hearing this, the Count was a little surprised at first. But then he asked his sister if she was really hitting on the lady she had just met. Then, outraged, Isabel said that she and the lady were socializing, and her brother should not stick his nose into their conversations. At which point the protagonist wondered why she was involved in all this again. The Count didn't know what to say anymore and just watched the girls, with Madeline asking, "Can Isabel let go of her hand?" But then a rather startled Isabel in an ironic tone asked who grabbed her hand first. Then the Count asked his sister to remember that every action leads to consequences. Then he turned to the protagonist and said that he didn't know how she knew his sister. But at the same time, he condescendingly told Tun that meddling in other people's families is not the most sensible behavior an aristocrat can have. Hearing this, Isabel hides behind Madeline's back while the protagonist just watches the Count. After these words, the Count rises back to the hall where the feast is held. Madeline at this time feels not very comfortable because she did not intend to cross with the Count. But his sister asks who he thinks he is, because he is not her father. Madeline is already very nervous and thinks that she thought it would be like this, and that the Earl will not even bother to thank her for calming his sister down. After this incident, the action moves forward again for some time. Madeline is already in her manor house and is once again reading some newspaper. The girl seems to be very interested in what she sees there. It turns out that in her previous life, the newspapers were only buzzing about Isabel's death. But today, they are writing about something completely different. So she realizes that the Count's sister is apparently safe and well. At last, Madeline's heart has calmed down because she was able to prevent a human death, while the girl thinks about the fact that probably in her past life no one could stop Isabel, especially if this quarrel was the last interaction between sister and brother. It is clear why he behaved so, perhaps because of guilt. She recalls the moment when Ian entered his sister's room while the protagonist was sitting at the piano. Then she noticed tears in his eyes, which were obviously related to the grief of losing his sister. Madeline finally understands why soon. After that incident, the Count gave her her own piano. She thinks that maybe he was apologizing to her for being rude and aggressive to her in that room. Madeline notices the table that is overflowing with letters and realizes that it is not as important now as it was then. She thinks it is more important that the next social evening will be at the Colgate country estate. Soon after being told where the next social evening was to take place, the action of the story moved to the time when it was to take place. Then the girl decided to come and stepped over the threshold of the very country estate, which was named as the place of the... She looked around and realized that Ian hadn't come to this evening. She wondered if that just meant that she would be able to make new acquaintances. Suddenly, some young man extends his hand to her from the side. It turned out to be the same guy who tried to get her attention at the last ball when they were sitting at the table, and who was stopped by the Count before he dared to approach her. The girl at that moment looked at him with surprise. Madeline decided to extend her hand to the boy, as if she was relieved that there would be no Count at the event, and she could make new acquaintances with other people from aristocratic families. The young man accompanying her says that he thought it was worth organizing the evening for the chance to escort her. But Madeline thinks that even in her past he has left many girls in tears after seducing them with such compliments. At this time, they slowly approach the table. The guy says that they were just having tea before dinner and asks Madeline if she is hungry. Then the girl briefly answers him and says that she is not hungry. After hearing the refusal, the guy again tries to talk to the girl and asks her if she has ever been to Vienna. According to him, it is an incredibly modern and developed city, which is impossible to describe in words how picturesque it is. The guy thinks that she would like it very much. During their conversation, one of the waiters came to them and brought them glasses of champagne. The guy says that the days in Vienna gave him the idea that mankind is waiting for infinite progress. The girl says that she is very much aware of this, but she also thinks about the fact that, unfortunately for George, the war will raze this town to the ground. At that moment, George holds out a glass of champagne to Madeline. But whose is the man's hand taking that glass and not letting it reach its destination? Also, this guy says he doesn't agree with George's ideas about Vienna. Then George asks if this guy really thinks so, and Madeline just looks to see who took the champagne glass that was meant for her. Turning around, she sees the Earl of Nottingham there along with his brother and sister. Their svita looked the most important at the event. The three of them looked majestic and very attractive, with George noticing that they have finally joined in the celebration. At this time, a boy and a young girl are watching them from the side. They are talking about the persons they see in front of them. The girl asks if the Earl of Nottingham is really the Earl of Nottingham, and then the boy says that apparently George was in the same class with Mr. Nottingham. The guy also notices that they look quite elegant. And the girl is happy that she came here today, while the protagonist looks at all the newly arrived guests and notices that this time Ian is not alone as it was in her previous life. She sees that his brother Eric has come with him, who is very happy to talk to George, as if they were old friends. Then Madeline notices that Isabel, who also came with her brother, is sitting on the chair in front of her. But this time, Isabel looks at Madeline strangely, as if she were a bit out of sorts. Suddenly, Madeline notices a conversation between George and the Earl's younger brother. Then George asks Eric if he really disagrees with his theory of humanity's progression, and then Eric says he's not sure about that, because it's unlikely that humanity will continue to progress peacefully. Then Count Nottingham himself intervenes in their conversation and says that people are selfish creatures. According to him, it is the nature of humans to compete with each other and destroy everything in their path. According to him, ironic as it may be, it is because of this that people have been able to make progress. George then asks if he understood Eric to mean that development depends on military force, to which he gets the answer that, in his interlocutor's view, reform always goes hand in hand with violence. Then George began to laugh very hard at these words. He asked the Earl of Nottingham if he really thought that in their age wars were possible. He said the world had never been as economically united as it is now, but Nottingham once again disagreed with his words. According to him, if such a need arises, a new armed conflict will not keep you waiting. At that moment, it was as if a ghost of himself from a past life had appeared behind his back. Hearing this, the protagonist began to look in the direction of the Count. Noticing this, Ian decided to ask what the protagonist thinks about it. Of course, the girl was very surprised by this question, but then looking directly at her ex-husband, she decided to voice her opinion regarding progress. According to her, she agrees that military might is the key to development. But at the same time, let it be so. She asks, can the Count justify millions of lost lives and broken judges in the name of making progress? She also noticed that the Count is correct in his statements. However, wars are started because of people who believe in necessary evils. At this point, looking directly at the Count, it was as if she was directly accusing him of this. Hearing these words, the Count thought about them for a while and asked what the main character's opinion was on the matter. Then everyone around looked at her with surprise and waited for her to answer. At the same time, the girl thinks that maybe she was too frank if she got so much attention. Then, seeing that the girl was confused, Eric said that he doubted that he could keep up with all this talk about politics, thus ending the conversation. The guy then turns the subject and asks if anyone is going to go to Wimbledon tennis this year. Then, after listening to the guy, George asks if the guy is still playing tennis. Then, Eric says that's right, because his older brother plays so well that he's even tempted to sign up for the men's doubles. Hearing this, Count tells his brother to stop praising him, but then the Earl's younger brother asks that it is his brother who stops being modest. Hearing these eulogies to the elder Earl, George says that he would very much like to meet the Earl on the court someday, at which point the protagonist rises from her seat. At the same time, Eric tells George that he has to beat him first to compete with Ian, but the Count seems to ignore it and watches Madeline's actions, while George answers Eric and asks him not to underestimate him. It turns out that at that moment, Madeline went out on the balcony and thought that she didn't want to express her disagreement with the Earl of Nottingham so openly. But she reassures herself that she didn't think the Earl was too upset about it either. She even seems to think that in fact he even liked it. At this point, she remembers the Count smiling and looking away rather happily slowly. Suddenly, the girl very quickly comes back from her thoughts. It turns out that all this is because she noticed Isabel walking with her young man in the garden of the house. She realizes that next to her is the same guy who was in the photo in the house in which she lived in a previous life. Seeing the way Isabel smiles at this young guy, she thinks that this is probably the same guy and her favorite person. The girl looking at them is very happy because she sees that they look very much in love. Madeline realizes that Isabel is even willing to die for him. At that moment, looking right at them, Madeline is happy and thinks that it would be great if she could love someone else as much as Isabel does. Suddenly, Madeline heard someone approaching her from behind. This young man called out to her. I turned around and saw Mr. Nottingham there. Then the Count asked the girl if he could talk to her about something. Hearing this, the protagonist makes a couple of steps in his direction, because she was well aware that if he comes closer, he will see Isabel, who is walking here with her young man with whom the Count has a very strained relationship because of political views. Then the Count once again asks if he can talk to him, but seeing that the girl is approaching him so rapidly, he seems to lose the power of speech and even blushes a little because of it. It turns out that the Earl of Nottingham wanted to talk to Madeline about what happened during their last meeting, and when she hears this, the girl asks when it was. But the Earl realizes that she's just being sarcastic and says that he shouldn't have scolded her for giving Isabel a helping hand. The Count says that he understands that Madeline is worried about his sister, but the girl says that there is nothing wrong with that and just tries to leave the balcony and the Count's company in a hurry. It turns out she's leaving so quickly because Isabel is about to be caught by the Earl. She realizes she has to get Ian out of here quickly, so she goes to the door and asks the Earl if they're going in the house. At this time, the Count is looking at the girl's back, and as if he was thinking about something. How unexpectedly he said that she discourages him. At that, according to him, this is not the first time this has happened. Naturally, slowly, a little surprised to hear this from the Count. But then the Count continues to talk and reports that he notices that Madeline is firmly letting him know that she doesn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy for him. To him, it all looks like she slowly despises him. At this point, the protagonist clenches her hand into a fist out of excitement and asks the Count why he thinks this way. But the Count says that he doesn't yet understand why he thinks this way, and yet he dares to suggest that maybe it's just his imagination. Then Nottingham holds out his hand to Madeline and says he hopes her dislike won't get worse. He says it won't do either of them any good. The guy says he doesn't know what's in store for them in the near future, and noting that the sun is setting and it's getting colder outside, he suggests that Madeline come inside. But the protagonist is still in no hurry to go back in and says that his phrase that it is unknown what awaits them in the future for her sounds as if ahead of them await only unhappiness and no joy. At the same time, she once again worships the guy and says that first, let him come into the house, because according to her, she would like to admire a little more the scenery that opens from the balcony. Hearing this, the Earl of Nottingham asks Madeline if it is true that she is unwilling to reveal herself to him even for a brief moment, but he notes that he respects her wishes and will leave her alone tonight. However, the guy firmly shows Madeline his position and says that from now on he does not intend to retreat any further, and in the end he obviously expects to be able to get his way. Hearing this, Madeline is very surprised by his words, all because in that instant she suddenly remembered the couple who were enjoying each other in the garden. She wondered how ridiculous they seemed in the eyes of those passionate lovers. In her opinion, Ian thinking obsessive love must have been incredibly funny to the couple. With the Count still standing in front of Madeline, she thinks he's standing in front of her as if he's protecting her from the wind. But she realizes that he's really just casting his shadow over her, not protecting her from the wind, which is why she realizes she can't let him give her false hopes for a happy life. The action of the story moves unexpectedly to Madeline's past life. When she was 25 years old, then a sad girl sat on her bed, while beside her lay her dog. At this point, Madeline looked very sad. She was once again thinking about her life and wondering how much longer she could live like this. At this point, she even shed a tear, thinking that she would live like this until she died. In doing so, she becomes very concerned about what will happen to her dog Corey when she's gone. And more importantly, she thinks about what will happen to her when Corey dies. She thinks that if he leaves her in this God-forsaken place, she might actually go mad, the girl asks you. Is she obliged to exist here for the rest of her life as if she were a ghost? She is also afraid that she might remain imprisoned even after her death. She also asks you what if she has to spend an eternity in this hell alone, without a single soul, at which point Corey pulls her away from these thoughts. The dog began to look sweetly at his mistress. And then the girl looked at him with shaking hands and said that he should not worry because the dog had nothing to worry about. So she seemed to calm herself. Immediately afterward, all the action shifts to the next morning, at which time the Count is writing some documents, while his butler comes up to him and tells him some unusual news. The Earl of Nottingham was very much surprised to hear this, and we learn that the butler had brought some news about Madeline, for she had done something unusual, so much so that even the Earl himself could not believe it. It turns out, according to his butler, and her ladyship left the estate under the cover of night, at which time the protagonist is already going somewhere in a car with her dog Corey. It turns out slowly headed to the Central Movie Theatre in London. Already being inside the theater, she cannot even believe that she is in a London movie theater, The girl thinks that she still managed to escape from home. She realizes that the estate must be in turmoil, and then she wonders how her husband is feeling, wondering if he's happy to be rid of her or if he's very upset. Turns out the girl had seen the movie Baby in 1921. This movie was a silent film starring Charlie Chaplin, where a tramp finds an abandoned child and raises him. Seeing what happens in the movie, the girl thinks about the fact that this is not even the main character's own child. She wonders how he can do so much for him, because these two do not have a drop of common blood, and yet they are a family. Suddenly, the main character began to cry very hard at the moment when Charlie Chaplin kissed his unborn son. All the other spectators in the audience were also very much disturbed by this scene. After a short time, she and her dog already returned to the mansion. The girl realizes that the time has passed very quickly, while she apologizes to Corey for making him wait. Immediately after these words, she starts pouring food into his bowl, while still admiring the fact that this movie was wonderful. In her opinion, the way people move on the wall just mesmerizes her spirit. The girl still keeps in touch with her dog and says she finally feels that wonderful feeling of freedom. She says it's just wonderful and asks her dog about it. Suddenly, she notices that her dog's food has run out, so she wonders where she can buy some food for Corey. While looking in the mirror, she notices that her clothes are a little dirty, so she wonders where she can wash them. Suddenly, a letter is slipped into her room right under the door. The man who was behind the door informs her that a telegram has arrived for her. Obviously, the girl is very much frightened by this and cannot take her eyes off the letter. According to her, it has not been a whole day since her departure. But she picks up a letter from the floor, and opening it, she sees that it is a letter from her husband. It says that he will wait for her at the station. Reading this, the girl's hands begin to shake, all because she thought she'd escaped if she could make it to London on her own, but apparently she jumped to conclusions, at which point her dog just stands there like you're supporting his mistress. Shaking, the girl raises that for some reason she seems to be relieved. But even with this, she still cannot take her eyes off the letter, because the girl realizes that she has to go back. Immediately after these thoughts, the action of the story shifts to the present day, when the girls are 17 years old. At the ball, they are at a young couple is dancing in the center of the room. At this point, the girl looks quite sad, because she thinks about the fact whether in this world cannot live comfortably without inheritance or marriage. She realizes that before dying should have remembered the name of at least 10 companies where you can invest. She begins to condemn herself for this, for in her opinion she is more deserving of the title of fool than noblewoman, at which point she seems to lean forward slightly. As she does this, suddenly a man's hand touches her forehead, and then looking up she sees the Count still trying to woo her. Ian explains his touch on the girl's forehead by the fact that she looks incredibly tired lately. He sits down next to her and says that he thinks maybe the London air is bad for her. Madeline says she agrees with the Earl of Nottingham that the air here is not the cleanest, but she says that she stays up late because of her studies. Naturally, hearing about it, the Count is very much surprised. He asks the girl if she is studying ancient Greek or something similar. But then the girl remembers what she's doing, because she was doing more bookkeeping. In her book, in this bookkeeping book, it's like a chicken was writing with its paw. She's very angry at her father for that. After she remembers it, the girl tells the guy that it's closer to ancient Greek tragedies. According to her, she puzzles over how to avoid an unavoidable fate. Hearing these words, the Count seems to admire the girl and wonders what she is talking about. But then Madeline decides to explain everything to him. According to her, simply put, she is thinking about how to support herself. Naturally, the Earl of Nottingham notices that young noblewomen don't care much about such things. Looking directly at the girl, he asks her if her father is the reason for it. Then, Madeline realized that it seems about her father's passion to live large even in London. Seeing that Madeline is a little embarrassed, the guy says that he apologizes to her for this. But Madeline asks him not to apologize because she really has to prepare for the worst. Then the Count says she'd better not beat herself up and find someone to settle the matter for her. He says a girl should think more practically. Then the smiling Madeline says she thinks most people do. At the same time, she realizes that most people do, but she doesn't want that. She wants to live on her own and provide for herself without anyone's help. Dear friends, and this is the end of this story. If you want to see the continuation, Then be sure to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell to not miss new videos. When under this video will accumulate 40,000 viewers or 5,000 likes, I will do for you the second part. Of course, if there will be enough chapters by then.